Can you see it? It's right here in front of me, right now. Watch. No.
While America's intellectual and artistic elite were experimenting with acid for self-exploration, the U.S. government was secretly giving this powerful new drug to prisoners, prostitutes, drug addicts, people who couldn't fight back, as one CIA officer put it. Unwitting college students, average citizens, and even American soldiers were dosed with LSD.
This is the story of a 30-year search by U.S. intelligence agencies to perfect mind control. Some of those engaged in that search The search would be endless. From brothels, an agent says, we learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom, to the mystical rites of a magical mushroom ceremony performed by an Indian shaman, to a Spanish bull ring. The bull has had electrodes implanted in the brain and is controlled by a scientist. There would be victims.
Oh, Jess.
One intelligence agency tried to peel this man's mind back to reveal its deepest secrets.
I'll live through it. I'll live through it.
This man worked on some of these programs. He would write of his work, it was fun, fun, fun.
San Francisco, 1960, a brothel in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood. The prostitutes working here have a very special pimp, the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically a man named George White, a narcotics detective hired by the CIA who has been accused post-mortem of corruption, rape, and murder.
This bizarre man would be an active participant in that search over the next 2 decades. His name is George White, an OSS captain who had formerly been with the Bureau of Narcotics. In his diary, seen here publicly for the first time, White left a legacy of the darker side of American intelligence work. He received his early OSS training at the British-run school at Oshawa, Canada, the same school where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was trained. White referred to the school in his diaries as the Oshawa School of Mayhem and Murder. Mike Burke, former OSS colleague of White's and now president of Madison Square Garden Center.
Very compelling fella, mysterious fella, almost mystical fella. He was fascinating because you knew something about him, but not enough about him to really get a fix on him. He also knew a great deal about the swifter elements of society, the gamier side of life, and he was very impressive in his technical knowledge of the underworld, so to speak.
George White, who was a Federal Bureau of Narcotic agent, was given a contract with the CIA.
While CIA operative George White and his associates watched from behind a one-way mirror, unsuspecting tricks were secretly dosed with LSD by the prostitutes, and their behavior was closely observed. The CIA wants to know how men react to LSD and sex. Can it be used to control Soviet agents? Can it be used by enemies to extract info from American agents?
He said one of our men gets beat up. He says you have to act real fast and teach these guys a lesson.
Charles Siragusa, a former narcotics officer and friend of White's.
He'll come around, he says, and break your kneecaps. And with that, one guy laughed, and George White always had a little Billy with him. And this one guy sort of naked. George White turned around and whapped him across the neck with it. Then he picked up a pool stick and started beating everybody up.
He made his point.
And he made his point.
George White was not a man of understatement or subtleties. His boss at OSS, Stanley Lovell, referred to him as deadly and dedicated. In this note from White's diaries, it says, call Lovell regarding TD. TD was a rather transparent cover for Truth Drug. George White worked with the Truth Drug Committee here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. They experimented with mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unwitting victims.
Experiment which violated every law in the United States of entrapping people, of abusing people. Just really a horrendous thing to do.
The committee soon learned there was no easy panacea, no truth drug at this stage. But White and later colleagues would not stop trying. The goal remained the same. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland, at Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hofmann, that led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The film that you see is considered by many experts to be the closest illustration of the effects of a hallucinogenic.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. After all of these years of us, those of us who were involved in looking for this secret drug, this was the only thing that began to look for the first time like it might be something like that.
Senator Frank Church said today there's a very real possibility that the CIA acted, in his words, like a rogue elephant.
In 1975, Congress paid out $750,000 to the family of Frank Olsen, who was a CIA employee that had jumped or been pushed from the 13th floor of the Manhattan hotel room he was sharing with another CIA man back in the 1950s. It turns out that Olsen had been secretly dosed with LSD not long prior to his suicide and had, as they called it in the 50s, a nervous breakdown. It took his family 20 years to find out the truth.
The CIA experimented with LSD in the early 1950s. Not all the subjects were told they were taking the mind-expanding drug. This, the commission concluded, was clearly illegal. One man died, committed suicide.
This is Richard Helms, CIA chief from 1966 to 1973. Helms oversaw many of the CIA's worst transgressions in foreign lands, and he eventually pled guilty for lying to Congress.
These were hypothetical things. Could this be done? Could that be done? Could you help out here? And all of these approaches were resisted totally, to the best of my knowledge, and as General Walters reported to me, and I believe is stated under oath.
After being forced to resign by President Nixon, Helms ordered all the records of MKUltra destroyed. But in 1977, a cache of 20,000 documents detailing just a small part of MKUltra's actions were discovered. Due to this bureaucratic mistake, there is some final proof of MKUltra and its use of LSD for mind control experiments. These are two of the most disturbing graduates of the MKUltra program. The Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who, while he was a young student at Harvard, fell victim to Professor Henry Murray's experiment that measured how people react under stress. Murray subjected his unwitting students, including Kaczynski, to what Murray himself called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks, assaulting his subjects' egos and most cherished ideals and beliefs.
At least 20 FBI agents converged on the cabin near the remote town of Lincoln, Montana, just after noon today, looking for evidence that could solve the mystery of the Unabomber. Sources say the suspect is Theodore John Kaczynski, born 53 years ago in Chicago, a graduate of a suburban Chicago high school. He earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard, whose 16 bombings began in the Chicago area, continued in Salt Lake City, and have since 1987 emanated from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Maybe the Unabomber was given LSD as well, though we'll never know for sure, thanks to CIA Director Richard Helms's having most of the program's records destroyed. This is Boston mobster Whitey Bulger, who was another illustrious graduate of MKUltra, and he was definitely given LSD while in Atlanta federal prison as a volunteer.
Alleged mobster James Whitey Bulger fled Boston in late 1994 as federal agents were about to arrest him in connection with 19 killings, racketeering, and other crimes that spanned the early 1970s to mid-1980s.
Bulger went into prison as a small-time thug, But when he got out, he took over the Boston underworld by corrupting nearly the entire Boston FBI office. James Whitey Bulger went on to become Boston's most powerful criminal and spent 16 years on the FBI's most wanted list. Whitey Bulger's henchmen later testified during his various trials that the gangster often talked about his experience with LSD and that it, quote, took him to the depths of insanity. Did LSD help transform a simple South Boston truck hijacker into a brilliant criminal? An unanswerable question, to be sure, but an interesting one nonetheless.
Emerged. And at that time, we saw a lot of, but LSD was in the white community, and not many blacks were using any of the hallucinogenic drugs. We saw the whites using LSD, and in the process of becoming, being diagnosed as being mentally incompetent and being housed or ordered into mental institutions. Many of these people were young adults whose minds were twisted from the use of LSD.
That's not just a myth. You personally saw it.
I saw it, yes, and we had hospitals in the Los Angeles General Hospital. We had the hospital out at Camarillo. We had one out in Norwalk, which was a mental treatment facility.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you, I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that
any of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I mean
think that was probably one of the things they had in mind.
I mean testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
But many drugs were tested in this way. A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic. And as their predecessors had a decade earlier, the CIA turned to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official, and by this time the stories about George White were legendary.
So the waiter says, "You may help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. I paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder, says, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question.
We're more and more lost souls on the street, more people who are strung out on bad drugs.
Let's get him first. The broad will slow the other one down. Let's get him.
The Hells Angels were one of the great media sensations of the late 1960s, appearing on magazine covers, movies, best-selling books like those of Hunter S. Thompson. For 2 or 3 years after the time they were adopted into the folds of pop culture by Ken Kesey, the rough and tumble California motorcycle gang were seen as the guardian angels of the hippie movement.
I've personally found the Hells Angels to be very frightening. They're scary folks. Of course, I was in prison with a lot of them too. Owsley and the Grateful Dead, who also had a love affair with the Hells Angels for a while, were selectively blind to that violence. At the point when I hooked up with Owsley and worked with him in a lab in Point Richmond, he was selling his output to a black guy named Laval. And he tended to have one dealer at any given time. But he would change dealers as soon as either he or his main dealer got uncomfortable.
At one point, the Hells Angels were the biggest customer for Owsley's LSD. They were buying LSD crystals from Bear, and they were tabling it up themselves. They were generating $250,000 a week, selling it just in the Bay Area.
At that point, Owsley chose Terry the Tramp of the Hells Angels as his main dealer, who could put on a fur coat and be very psychedelic and come across as soft and cuddly, but who was still a very violent guy.
The Hells Angels' point man for LSD was John Terrence Tracy, aka Terry the Tramp. Terry the Tramp was a counterculture superstar. He appeared in numerous photo shoots for the Hells Angels, interviews. He appeared in the Hells Angels movie, and he made himself the face of the kinder, gentler Hells Angels, until he popped up dead from an overdose of barbiturates, a drug often used to bring you down from the highs of methamphetamine or LSD.
I've heard several different versions of how Terry died. One version is that he committed suicide, and another version is that he was murdered and he was forced to swallow the overdose of barbiturates that killed him. Terry had given a lot of money, Hells Angel money, to Billy Hitchcock to put in Swiss banks, as had Bear. Bear had given a lot of the money he'd gotten from making LSD and given it to Billy Hitchcock to stash in a Swiss bank. And then they both asked Billy to invest it for them in the stock market, which Billy did. And he invested it in a very highly leveraged deal, a stock deal, which fell through, and he lost all their money.
But Billy Hitchcock, Timothy Leary's former landlord and the heir to one of America's greatest fortunes, may be the most to blame for Terry the Tramp, the psychedelic Hells Angels' death.
So it's possible that he got murdered by the Hells Angels because he lost some of their money. It's possible that he committed suicide because things really didn't work out for him.
In 1965, an Anaheim, California-based motorcycle gang led by a man nicknamed Farmer John Griggs, and who usually supported themselves by robbing supermarkets, rode into the Hollywood Hills and invaded the home of a hotshot movie producer.
They took his LSD, threw away their guns, and decided to become psychedelic saviors of the world. They decided to distribute LSD instead of robbing people.
They rechristened themselves the Brotherhood of Eternal Love.
In early '68, after Owsley had been busted, after Bear was busted in Orinda, I set out, I set up another lab. And I had found a source of raw material in Europe, finally, my own source of raw material. And I eventually managed to get a kilo of lysergic acid, which is enough raw material to make 3.6 million doses of LSD. Bear had sent me to Billy when I was looking for sources of raw material, and Billy, in fact, suggested the guy who turned out to be my best source. So when I wanted to try to find a distributor for the LSD that I was going to make, because I certainly didn't want to sell to the Hells Angels, I went to Billy for advice on who would be good. And Billy told me about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which had been organized by a fellow named John Griggs.
So the Brotherhood of Eternal Love fall in love with LSD. They had pledged to stop robbing after their acid enlightenment, and they got involved in smuggling huge amounts of marijuana from Mexico and hashish from Afghanistan, offset the losses they took in their LSD operation. They were supposedly giving it away. One of their favorite tactics was to stuff hash into surfboards coming into America. Tim Scully and his new partner, Nick Sand, were supplying the Brotherhood with tons of acid, a lot of it known as Orange Sunshine, a lot of which they really did give out for free. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love probably sold and gave away more LSD than anybody on the West Coast. They kind of brought the West Coast and East Coast psychedelic scenes together.
John Griggs, who was the leader of the Brotherhood, went back to Millbrook, which was at the time the center of LSD research on the East Coast, met Tim Leary, and was advised by Tim Leary that he should set up a religion to protect them legally. So they incorporated in California as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love.
The Brotherhood arrived on the scene just at the right time for Dr. Timothy Leary. Thanks to a series of police raids on the Millbrook estate in upstate New York, one of them led by future Watergate burglar G. Gordon Liddy, who was a local state prosecutor at the time. The East Coast was getting hot for the professor, and he headed west to hole up on the ranch of the Brotherhood of the Eternal Love.
Among the decisions was one on Dr. Timothy Leary, the former Harvard psychologist who likes to experiment with drugs. He was convicted of carrying a half ounce of marijuana on which the federal tax had not been paid.
Professor Timothy Leary was sentenced to 20 years in prison for a pair of marijuana cases involving a bag of weed and a few roaches. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love, flush with millions in drug profits, ponied up $25,000 to the radical Weather Underground, a collection of college kids turned radical bombers devoted to bringing down the American government to help free their spiritual father, Timothy Leary, from his prison cell.
Radical left-wing group, the Weathermen, has claimed responsibility for yesterday's dynamiting of a statue of a Chicago policeman.
In September, less than 9 months into a sentence, Timothy Leary escaped from prison by shimmying along a drainage pipe, hopping a barbed wire fence, and jumped into the back of a pickup truck driven by the Weather Underground.
I escaped with the help of the Weathermen Underground. 25 of their crack underground operators came to California for 6 weeks before my escape. Joined us in the fight for freedom because we are everywhere, and we're happy, and we're free, and we're going to make the world free.
While they were helping Timothy Leary escape from prison, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love were starting to have major legal troubles of their own. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, forerunner of the DEA, built a huge conspiracy case involving not just LSD, but marijuana and hashish as well.
Almost all the time that I was making LSD, the federal agents followed me every time they got me in their sights, every time I went home to Berkeley. So all the time I was doing it, they knew I was doing it. They followed me while I was getting chemicals, and then I'd lose them with a truckload of chemicals and go off, and they never found the lab.
During their investigation of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, the IRS estimated they'd made over $200 million. More than $1 billion in today's money, There was 1 million tablets of orange sunshine LSD seized, along with the materials to make 14 million more. There was also 6,000 pounds of hash seized and some methamphetamine. And so ended one of the key LSD pipelines in history. Most of the drug-dealing biker hippies from the Brotherhood of Eternal Love received relatively minor sentences, except for the chemists Scully and Sand, who received serious prison terms. Billy Hitchcock, the owner of Timothy Leary's Millbrook, New York headquarters, was actually a part of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love case. His Wall Street skills had made him integral in helping the Brotherhood launder their tens and millions of drug profits in banks all around the world, from the Bahamas to Switzerland. This is the kind of thing that would get you a very long prison term now. Money laundering for a major drug ring. But despite his key role in this aspect of the global drug trade, Billy Mellon Hitchcock, member of one of America's most prominent families, a family that counted the CIA director as a friend and frequent house guest, was sentenced to probation and a small fine.
In the view of the feds, they think of drug organizations as pyramids, and they think of the people who are the manufacturers and the organizers of the manufacturing as being the top of the pyramid. So they consider them to be the Class 1 targets.
While things were falling apart for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, Timothy Leary and his wife were holed up in Algeria, of all places. After escaping from U.S. prison, they needed somewhere to hide out, and a radical leftist government had recently taken power in the North African country.
After he escaped from a California prison, he went to Algeria, left in a huff because he couldn't hold a news conference, and went to Lebanon. Well, today, Lebanon expelled him and sent him to Egypt. But Egypt said Leary and 3 companions, 2 Black Panthers and a female Yippie, were not welcome.
Algeria became a haven for airplane hijackers, terrorists, and so-called political prisoners from America, like Dr. Timothy Leary. And this crazy scene was all controlled by fugitive Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver.
Timothy Leary spent only a few days in Algeria. During that time, he was kept under wraps. A scheduled news conference was canceled by the government.
Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver said that LSD advocate Timothy Leary, who escaped from a California prison last month, has joined forces with him in Algeria.
Besides being such a bizarre turn of events, Leary's exile in Algeria was a profound and telling end to his days as a revolutionary. And if you see the disgraced doctor's trajectory as LSD's messiah as a metaphor for the rise and fall of LSD itself, then this conversation between Leary and the Black Panthers' Minister of Information, Eldridge Cleaver, is very insightful.
Now, these people who are walking around seeking freedom and liberation through drugs, I think they are illusionary allies. Much of the drug culture in the United States for many years was focused on you. You were the spokesman for that. You have been looked upon as the high priest.
The would-be acid revolution, the quest for enlightenment through LSD, was a very bourgeois revolution, a white revolution that really had no connection to would-be social justice movements like the Black Panthers.
And they call it revolution, and it's nothing but child's play, it's folly.
Leary was interviewed on television not long after his capture and returned to confinement, and as always, he made for a riveting interview subject.
Since we're going to be sitting here and chatting for a little while, first I think what I'd like to know is, who is this man who has the name Timothy Leary? Who is Timothy Leary? Who is he as a person?
I'm a philosopher. I'm a psychologist who has been studying the nervous system for the last 30 years. I've written 10 books and hundreds of articles. I probably know as much or more about how the nervous system works, the far galactic outposts of awareness and the range of the human experience as any scientist around.
After his early release from prison in the late 70s, courtesy of California Governor Jerry Brown, Leary kept clutching at the fame he used to have, like a drug user chasing his first high.
at that same time, back in 1969, we had a television personality by the name of Art Linkletter. And his son bailed out of a window out of him.
Daughter?
Pardon?
Was it his daughter?
Daughter bailed out of a window in New York thinking that she could fly. And it was at that time it was determined that LSD was a tremendously debilitating drug.
But by this time, the hippie revolution was long dead. LSD had a terrible reputation, and the former Harvard professor was more hated than loved. For example, by people like Art Linkletter, who blamed his own daughter's suicide on Leary and his promotion of LSD.
And I think that this man, Dr. Leary, I had hoped he would die. I had hoped he would be hung. Then I had hoped he'd stay in prison for life. And now I'm glad he's out as a pitiful example of an aging hippie, a gruesome spectacle of how drugs can ruin a brilliant mind.
As for the young chemist Tim Scully, his day of reckoning in court did not go well. The judge was convinced that Scully was an idealist, not in it for the money. You might think this bode well for his sentencing. It did not. The judge told Scully, idealists are the most dangerous ones.
I did come to believe that the judge had a real point. Getting high on idealism, if you let it lead you down the unfortunately yellow brick road of expediency to doing things that you know are wrong because you believe that the end justifies the means, can lead to some really horrific things happening. And my advice to people, if they find themselves being really high on ideals, is to be very careful about being expedient in your decisions and make sure not to do any harm. Because it's all too easy to fall into rationalizing, doing things that you'll regret later.